In the vast setting of the ancient world, as it unfolded before the year 333 before Christ, the political and military landscape of the Mediterranean was marked by a clash of cultures that would shape the destinies of entire peoples. For centuries, the Persian Empire had risen as the greatest power on earth, stretching its borders from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea, ruling through a system that combined immense wealth, trade routes, and a refined administrative structure. On the other side of this colossal power stood the Greeks, fragmented into dozens of city-states that lived in constant competition, but that, when united by a common threat, could become an almost unstoppable force. Since the Persian Wars, fought between 490 to 479 before Christ, this conflict between East and West had left open wounds that never healed. The Greek victory at Marathon, the heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae, and the fierce resistance at Salamis had proven that numbers, wealth, and size were not everything. But now, more than a century later, these rivalries were about to re-emerge on an even larger scale, led by the hands of a young Macedonian who dared to dream bigger than all those who came before him. The beginning of the 4th century before Christ was a period of transition. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens was weakened, Sparta had lost its supremacy, and Thebes had become a regional power for a brief time. This power vacuum created space for the kingdom of Macedonia, until then considered barbaric by the southern Hellenes, but which, under the visionary leadership of Philip II, managed to modernize its army and introduce revolutionary military tactics, such as the famous Macedonian phalanx with extremely long spears that turned ordinary men into living walls. While the Greek city-states consumed themselves in intrigues, Philip unified Greece under the League of Corinth and conceived a dream that until then seemed unreachable: to invade the Persian Empire, to avenge the ancient aggressions and take the Greek world beyond the Aegean. From this fragile unification, built more out of respect for Macedonian power than true harmony, Europe and Asia were connected by a thin line of tension. The Greeks saw in the East a world of wealth and excess, of luxury and decadence. The Persians, on the other hand, looked at the Greeks as turbulent and undisciplined peoples, incapable of recognizing the greatness of a stable empire. It was on this unstable board that the young Alexander appeared, son of Philip, a prince who inherited a well-trained kingdom and an army forged for impossible challenges. The war that was to come would not be just a dispute over territories, but a duel of strategies, cultures, and ideas. Asia Minor, also known as Anatolia, became the inevitable point of contact. It was a strategic region, full of Greek cities under Persian rule, important ports and roads that led directly to the heart of the empire. Alexander knew that to conquer something lasting, he would need to face the greatest power in the world on its own soil. This encounter between the young and audacious king and the Persian monarch, Darius III, who trusted in the vastness of his armies, was inevitable. Before the confrontation, tension could already be felt in every port, every captured city, and every conquered garrison. The battles fought at the Granicus River, and the maneuvers in the region served as a rehearsal for the great clash that would change history. Everything converged toward a battle that would become a symbol, the Battle of Issus. Before the spears crossed, intentions were clear. Alexander would not be content with small victories, nor would he retreat in the face of the immense enemy army. Darius, in turn, could not allow a foreign invader to challenge his authority with impunity. The winds of history were moving, and the narrow lands between the sea and the mountains in the region of Issus would be the stage where two worlds would collide. This was the context of the ancient world, a stage of empires and ambitions about to ignite under the strength of one man determined to forever change the course of history. In the heart of Macedonia, in the middle of the 4th century before Christ, one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of humanity was born, Alexander. Son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, he grew up in an environment where politics, war, and culture were intertwined in every aspect of life. From a very early age, the young prince was exposed to a kingdom that was in full transformation, leaving behind the image of a land considered peripheral by classical Greeks and rising as a disciplined and ambitious military power. His education was shaped so that he would become not only a warrior but a leader capable of inspiring and commanding men in the face of the greatest adversities. Olympias, his mother, with a strong temperament and mystical convictions, instilled in him the belief that his destiny was grand, and that there was something divine in his birth, while Philip gave him a living model of military strategy, diplomacy, and conquest. Thus, Alexander grew up knowing that his life would be greater than himself. The intellectual formation of Alexander was carefully planned by Philip, who brought one of the greatest philosophers of all time to educate his son, Aristotle. Under the tutelage of this wise man, Alexander immersed himself in philosophy, literature, and science. He learned to admire Homer's Iliad and to dream of heroic deeds worthy of Achilles. Study was not only theoretical. Aristotle taught him to observe the world with a critical and rational eye, to understand different cultures, and to think like a statesman. This education made him a man who did not limit himself to seeing war as mere violence, but as an instrument for building an empire and spreading ideas. This union between strength and knowledge would become one of the most striking traits of his leadership. Beyond intellect, Alexander developed physical and tactical skills from a very young age. He participated in hunts, endurance exercises, and military training that prepared him for life on the battlefield. He was fearless on horseback, bold in dangerous terrains, and obsessed with challenges that tested his limits. A remarkable episode from his youth was when he tamed Bucephalus, an untamable horse that no one in the palace could control. Realizing that the animal was frightened by its own shadow, Alexander turned him toward the sun and took the reins with remarkable calm. From that moment on, Bucephalus became his loyal companion, and this story spread as an omen that the young prince had a special gift for mastering situations that seemed impossible. This refined education and practical experience forged a personality marked by ambition, self-confidence, and charisma. Alexander did not just study about the world, he prepared himself to conquer it. Since adolescence, he accompanied his father on military campaigns and observed up close the complex politics among the Greek city-states. He witnessed betrayals, fragile alliances, and the weight of strategic decisions absorbing everything, like someone learning a game he would later play with a mastery no one else had ever achieved. When Philip was assassinated, Alexander was just over 20 years old, but he was already ready to take the throne. He inherited a highly disciplined army, an ambitious plan of expansion against Persia, and, above all, the conviction that his name would forever be inscribed among the greatest. The young king, however, was not content with simply being an heir. He infused the kingdom with a new spirit of unshakable courage and limitless boldness. For Alexander, life was a unique opportunity to transform the world. His education had planted in him the desire to cross borders, to unite peoples, and to create something greater than any kingdom had ever dreamed. And it was with this spirit that he decided to confront the greatest empire the earth had ever known. Thus, the encounter between Alexander and Darius III would become inevitable, and the events that would lead to Issus began to take shape in the mind of the young conqueror. While Alexander was growing up in an environment of discipline and ambition, on the other side of the known world, the vast Persian Empire was ruled by a sovereign whose power seemed unquestionable. Darius III took the throne at a time when Persia was no longer the invincible power it had been in the days of Cyrus and Darius I. Although it was still a colossal empire, stretching from regions near India to Egypt and Anatolia, the Persian administrative machine showed clear signs of internal wear. Local governors, known as satraps, often accumulated power that was almost independent, and the immense distances made it difficult to maintain effective control over all the provinces. This situation created an empire that, though rich and populous, was less cohesive than it appeared to its enemies. Darius III was a man of great stature and imposing appearance, but his rise to the throne did not occur because of the strength of his personality or due to his own military achievements. He was placed in power through a palace conspiracy after the fall of the usurper Bessus, and although he had personal courage, he lacked the strategic genius and determination that would characterize his Macedonian rival. Upon inheriting the throne, he found an empire whose central authority was threatened not by external enemies, but by the internal tensions of its provinces. Even so, he trusted in the weight of his numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an economy abundant in resources, and a communication system that allowed the mobilization of forces in different points in a short time. It was a natural confidence for someone who ruled over the largest empire in the world up to that point. However, behind the grandeur there were problems that eroded Persian strength. The cultural diversity that in earlier times had been an advantage in managing different peoples now made unity difficult in times of crisis. The Persian tradition of delegating wide powers to satraps created slowness in decision-making, since many military campaigns suffered from conflicting regional interests. Furthermore, the Persians had grown accustomed to waging war with numbers. Their armies were vast, composed of varied contingents from across the empire, but rarely possessed the training and homogeneous discipline of smaller and more specialized forces, such as those of the Macedonian army. This overconfidence in quantity would prove to be a fatal mistake in the battle that was to come. Darius, however, was not blind to the approaching threat. When he learned of the Macedonian invasion, he mobilized his forces with the intention of quickly crushing the young invader and sending a clear message to any other power that dared to challenge Persia. To him, Alexander was just an impetuous prince, perhaps talented, but without the experience of commanding a war on a large scale. The Persian logic was simple: lure the enemy, surround him, and destroy his forces using numerical superiority. He believed that a single decisive confrontation would be enough to put an end to Macedonian audacity. This blind confidence would be tested at Issus, for while Darius had an empire, Alexander had something that no map could measure: iron discipline, swiftness of movement, and a mind prepared to turn any situation into an advantage. At that time, Persian power still seemed impossible to shake, but history was about to prove that even gigantic empires could be defeated by brilliant strategies. With the death of Philip II and the rise of Alexander to the throne, Macedonia inherited not only a highly trained army, but also an ambitious project: the invasion of the Persian Empire. Alexander, still very young, knew that he first needed to consolidate his power internally before crossing the Aegean Sea. As soon as he took command, he crushed internal revolts among the Greek peoples who sought to free themselves from Macedonian domination and reaffirmed the authority of the League of Corinth. Once unity was secured, he turned his eyes eastward. The plan was bold and dangerous: to cross into Asia Minor with a relatively small army and face the most feared power in the world. Many believed that this campaign would end in disaster, but Alexander saw in Persia the opportunity to transform his life into something that would be forever inscribed in history. The first challenge came with the crossing into Asia in the year 334 before Christ. He led about 40,000 men, an insignificant number compared to the Persian forces, but highly disciplined and loyal. Shortly after disembarking, he was met by a Persian contingent on the banks of the Granicus River. This battle, seemingly minor, was the first great test of the young king's military genius. Despite the difficulties imposed by the terrain and the initial resistance, Alexander achieved a decisive victory that opened the doors to Asia Minor. With this conquest, he showed the world that he was not merely an ambitious adventurer, but a commander of clear vision and boundless audacity. The psychological impact of this victory was immense. Greek cities under Persian control began to surrender without a fight, recognizing in him a liberator. After Granicus, Alexander marched systematically along the cities of the coast of Asia Minor, liberating them from Persian control while at the same time securing their loyalty to Macedonia. He knew he needed to keep his supply lines safe and establish a solid base before facing the core of Persian power. This stage was marked as much by diplomatic intelligence as by military strength. In each city he conquered, he sought to respect customs and traditions, reinforcing the image that he was not a destructive conqueror, but a leader bringing a new order. This behavior facilitated alliances and made his influence spread even faster. As Alexander advanced, Darius III realized that he could no longer ignore the threat. He prepared a gigantic army and began gathering contingents from all parts of the empire. Alexander, aware of this, continued his strategy of maintaining the initiative and choosing the battlefield. The Persian mobilization indicated an inevitable confrontation. The chosen point would be near the city of Issus, where the forces of both leaders would meet in an unexpected way. The Persian army would try to crush Alexander with sheer numbers, but what was about to unfold would show that the true war would be decided by cunning and courage. As he moved forward, Alexander was conquering not only territory, but also fame. His soldiers began to see him as an invincible leader, someone destined for grand achievements. This confidence would become one of the greatest Macedonian assets. He himself exposed himself to danger on the front lines, creating a bond of respect and loyalty that no rival army could equal. By the time he reached the lands of Syria, the tension was almost palpable. The two forces were destined to collide, and the moment that would define the future of the entire region was approaching rapidly. After the victory at the Granicus River and the lightning campaign through the cities of Asia Minor, Alexander consolidated control over the coastal region and continued marching south towards Syria, moving like a calculated storm that no one could stop. As his forces advanced, he established garrisons, left trusted commanders to protect the territory, and organized supplies so that his army would never be without food or reinforcements. This discipline and planning were the secret to keeping a relatively small contingent in perfect shape even far from home. During these maneuvers, news began to spread. Darius III had mobilized one of the largest armies the world had ever seen, gathering soldiers from all regions of the Persian Empire and marching to confront him personally. This inevitable encounter began to take on dramatic contours, two worlds marching against each other until they collided. Darius's initial approach was strategic. He intended to cut Alexander's supply line and force him to fight in a disadvantageous position. However, the movements of both armies ended up creating an unexpected outcome. Darius, in his attempt to reach the Mediterranean coast to block the enemy's rear, ended up placing himself behind the Macedonian forces. Realizing this, Alexander quickly turned his army north, forcing a direct confrontation near the small city of Issus. The geographical position was unique. A narrow corridor of plain between the sea and the mountains, a place where the Persian numerical advantage would be severely limited. It was the perfect scenario for Alexander, who understood better than anyone how to turn apparent disadvantages into victories. When the two forces came into view, the contrast was striking. The Persian army, gigantic, formed a line that seemed endless. Men from all parts of the empire, archers from Babylon, horsemen from Media, infantry from Persia, each contingent with its own language, culture, and weapons. Darius, confident, placed himself at the center, surrounded by his personal guard, convinced that numerical superiority would be enough to crush the invader. On the other side, Alexander led a smaller contingent, but one that was cohesive and perfectly trained. His men knew exactly where to be, how to move, and above all trusted the judgment of their commander, who always marched at the front, ready to share the fate of his army. The tension was so great that every step echoed like an announcement of destiny. The night before the battle was marked by strategies drawn up by torchlight, discussions of formations, and a heavy silence that preceded the roar of weapons. Alexander knew he needed to use the terrain as a weapon, and that he could not give Darius time to expand his lines or reorganize his forces. At dawn, he gathered his commanders and laid out the plan that would change the course of the battle. Issus would be the place where the young, bold, and determined king would face the Persian monarch himself for the first time. It was the beginning of a confrontation that would put at stake not only territories, but the very idea of which culture would dominate the ancient world. The choice of terrain at Issus was a turning point, and one of the central elements in understanding why the battle fought there would forever change the course of the war between Macedonia and Persia. The region where the two forces met was a narrow geographical corridor, bounded on one side by a mountain range that stretched like a natural wall, and on the other by the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, which crashed incessantly along the coast. This confined space created a bottleneck that neutralized the Persian army's main advantage, the ability to extend their lines for kilometers and encircle the enemy. Unlike the vast plains where the number of men can decide a war, Issus offered only a narrow field, perfect for someone with a smaller but far more cohesive and well-organized army. Darius, in his attempt to surprise Alexander, ended up entangling himself in terrain that favored exactly the enemy he intended to crush. His troops were immense, but the difficulty of maneuvering such a large force in such a limited strip of land meant that most of his soldiers were practically useless in the rear. Only a portion of the Persian force managed to position itself adequately for combat, while the ranks became crowded with no room for swift movements. The Persian cavalry, traditionally feared, also lost part of its effectiveness, as there was no space to open up for a devastating charge. It was as if the very landscape conspired in Alexander's favor. On the other hand, the Macedonian formation, smaller and more disciplined, found in these conditions the ideal environment. Alexander, a master at reading terrain, took advantage of every meter of space. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissas, formed a compact barrier capable of holding off frontal advances, while the cavalry units were strategically placed on the flanks, ready to strike at the enemy's vulnerable points. This organization was possible because the Macedonians trained to act as a single unit, adapting to hostile terrains and responding quickly to orders. In the narrow field of Issus, this cohesion became an invisible weapon, deadlier than any number. Another important factor was the Pinarus River, which crossed the plain. Although it was neither deep nor wide, it created a natural obstacle that slowed the Persian advance and gave Alexander the opportunity to use the water as a temporary defensive line. The Macedonians positioned themselves in such a way that the river became an additional challenge for those who wanted to reach them, turning every Persian step into a slow and vulnerable movement. Meanwhile, Alexander carefully organized his right wing, where he himself would lead the decisive charge. Thus, what seemed to be only a geographical detail became the key to the battle. Darius, with all his strength, was trapped in a cage of space. Alexander, with far fewer men, turned that confinement into an advantage. Every mountain, every patch of land, and even the sea itself became a silent ally for the brilliant mind of the young commander. It was as if the entire landscape had been prepared to amplify Macedonian courage and discipline, while suffocating the arrogance and numbers of the Persian army. On the morning of the Battle of Issus, Alexander stood before his commanders and presented a plan that would be remembered as one of the greatest examples of military genius in ancient history. Knowing that he faced an enemy far superior in numbers, he was fully aware that the only chance of victory lay in disorganizing the Persian line and striking directly at the center where Darius III was positioned. This objective required a swift, precise, and coordinated maneuver capable of transforming a smaller army into an irresistible force. Alexander studied the terrain, analyzed the banks of the Pinarus River, and decided that he would use every inch of the narrow plain to neutralize Darius's greatest weapon, the sheer number of soldiers. The plan was based on three central elements. First, the Macedonian phalanx would serve as the backbone of the entire defense. These formations, armed with long spears called sarissas, would create an almost impenetrable wall that would hold the Persian line and prevent the mass of soldiers from breaking through the center. Second, the auxiliary troops and Greek mercenaries would be responsible for protecting the left flank, which would be under the heaviest pressure from the bulk of the Persian forces. Third, and most decisive, Alexander himself would take position on the right flank, leading the Macedonian cavalry and his elite guard in a lightning strike aimed directly at Darius. He did not want just to win. He wanted to destabilize the mind of the Persian king and force a psychological collapse of the enemy army. The disposition of the Macedonian troops reflected Alexander's cold reasoning and boldness. He kept his lines compact, leaving no gaps that could be exploited by the enemy, and made last-minute adjustments to align his forces with the uneven terrain. His confidence was so great that he chose to personally lead the riskiest maneuver, placing himself where the fighting would be fiercest. To him, commanding meant being on the front line, a behavior that inspired his men, and at the same time confused his opponents, who were not accustomed to seeing a king risk his own life in this way. On the Persian side, Darius deployed his cavalry and infantry in a wide formation, believing he could envelop the Macedonians, but the lack of space forced him to keep part of his army in the rear, unable to join the battle in its opening moments. This limitation was exactly what Alexander wanted. At the sound of the trumpets, the phalanx advanced slowly, with almost mechanical discipline, forming an impenetrable barrier that absorbed the initial impact of the Persian assault. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Alexander waited for the exact moment to unleash his devastating charge. The brilliance of his tactic lay not only in the positioning of the troops, but in understanding the psychological effect of a targeted strike. He knew that if he managed to break the line where Darius stood, the king's flight would cause a chain reaction throughout the Persian army. This bold plan, which many would have considered suicidal, depended on perfect synchronization between the defense at the center and the deadly speed at the edge of the flank. It was as if the entire battlefield were a massive chessboard, and Alexander had planned every move with a clarity Darius never imagined facing. When the forces were ready, and the dust rose with the first advances, the strategy began to take shape. The discipline and precision with which the young king executed this plan would show the world how a small army could defeat a gigantic empire. Issus would become a masterclass in the art of war. The field of Issus sank into a tense silence as the two forces approached, until the sound of Persian drums and Macedonian trumpets tore through the air and marked the beginning of the clash. The Persian infantry lines, stretched along the narrow corridor, advanced first, confident that their overwhelming numbers would crush the Macedonians quickly. The dust raised by the feet of thousands of soldiers created a thick curtain, blurring vision and muffling sounds, but nothing could hide the magnitude of the collision that was about to take place. The Persian archers launched a rain of arrows, turning the sky into a dark cloud of death, attempting to open gaps even before physical contact. The Macedonian phalanx, however, advanced in an almost mechanical fashion, protected by their large shields and holding a wall of spears that seemed to grow out of the mist of dust. Each soldier knew exactly where to stand, creating an impenetrable line as if they were the gears of a single machine. The impact between the two forces was brutal and echoed like thunder. The Persians pressed violently, trying to break the center, and for a few moments the battle seemed to favor Darius, as the number of enemies was so great that their advance looked inevitable. Men fought shoulder to shoulder with spears, swords, and shields, clashing in a frantic rhythm, but it was precisely there, under maximum pressure, that Macedonian discipline proved its superiority. With every step taken by the Persians, the phalanx absorbed the blow and responded with precision, pushing them back with their sarissas, creating small openings that quickly turned into lethal traps. The organization of Alexander's army prevented chaos from taking over his line, while the diversity and disorganization of the Persian army began to become a problem. On the left of the Macedonian line, the allied Greek contingents had to withstand intense attacks from the Persian cavalry, which tried to open a breach on this flank to encircle Alexander's army. This was one of the most dangerous moments of the battle, as the Persians nearly managed to break through the lines. However, even under enormous pressure, the soldiers held firm, resisting the onslaught while waiting for the moment when Alexander's planned maneuver would make the difference. The combat spread across the narrow ground, and every meter of land became contested with blood. In the center, the fight continued fiercely, but little by little the discipline advantage of the Macedonians began to impose itself. The Persian pressure was no longer as effective because the rear lines could not advance due to lack of space. The gigantic number of soldiers turned into disorganization as the men at the front were pushed against each other, unable to use their weapons freely. This congestion began to suffocate the Persian offensive and opened small gaps that Alexander had been waiting to exploit. At this moment, the young king, positioned on the right flank, realized that the time for the decisive move was approaching. Personally commanding the elite cavalry, he awaited the fraction of a second when the battle would shift from chaos to opportunity. As the dust made the battlefield almost invisible, the shouts of soldiers and the sound of clashing metal echoed like a constant roar. The battle had begun, but the true strike was yet to come. Alexander kept his eyes fixed on Darius's position, and every second of resistance at the Macedonian center brought closer the moment of his devastating offensive. It was the calm before the storm that would change the course of the day. At the height of the combat, when the center of the battle was already engulfed in a whirlwind of chaos, and the dust on the field made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe, Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus, rode ahead of his elite cavalry and executed the maneuver that would go down in history as the boldest and most decisive strike of the Battle of Issus. He had waited patiently for the Macedonian center to withstand the pressure and for the Persian line to begin losing momentum. As soon as he noticed the weakening of the enemy's front ranks, he gathered his men, pointed his spear toward the point where Darius III was positioned, and ordered the charge. The assault was fast, fierce, and precise, advancing like an arrow shot straight into the heart of the Persian army. It was an extremely risky move because if the offensive failed, Alexander would find himself isolated in the middle of thousands of enemies, but the young king trusted in his speed and in the psychological effect of a direct attack against the monarch himself. The maneuver began on the right flank, where the Macedonian cavalry was arranged in a tight formation. They galloped at full speed, forming a wedge that tore open the Persian lines, breaking through with an impact that seemed to split the battlefield in half. The Macedonian horsemen attacked first with long lances and then with short swords, carving a corridor of destruction, while Alexander at the front directed every advance with almost superhuman vigor. The dust thrown up by the hooves mixed with the war cries, creating a scene of pure, organized violence. Meanwhile, the phalanx in the center continued to push forward, driving the Persians farther back, which divided the pressure and created even more confusion. This direct attack on Darius III had a devastating effect. The Persian king himself, who watched the approach of the enemy cavalry, saw his position become vulnerable. For an instant, the two worlds stared at each other. On one side, a young king determined to win or die. On the other, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, realizing that the wall of men around him could no longer protect him. The sight of the Macedonian charge coming straight at him shook Darius's confidence. Fearing encirclement, he turned his chariot and fled, trying to save his own life. This act, though understandable, had immediate and fatal consequences for the cohesion of the Persian army. The king's flight triggered instant panic among the troops. Soldiers who had been fighting bravely began to retreat, believing that all was lost. The sight of Darius abandoning the battlefield was enough to turn what discipline remained into sheer despair. Many threw down their weapons and fled in disorder, while others tried to escape along the coast or through the narrow mountain passes. Within minutes, a massive army began to disintegrate before a much smaller foe. Seeing this, Alexander pressed the attack even harder, not allowing the Persians to regroup. Victory at that moment was sealed. The cavalry's maneuver not only decided the battle, but also showed the world Alexander's audacity and military genius. He did not seek to win by attrition. He struck directly at the most important point, the enemy's morale. By forcing Darius to flee, he turned the fight into a collapse. This strategy would be remembered and studied for centuries as a perfect example of how courage, discipline, and speed can bring down a gigantic army. When Darius III turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, the psychological impact on his soldiers was as devastating as the Macedonian offensive itself. The largest army in the world collapsed before Alexander's eyes. From that moment on, the fight ceased to be an organized confrontation and turned into a hunt. The Persians, in panic, tried to escape in every way possible. Some ran toward the mountains, others sought refuge along the coast, while many simply abandoned their weapons and shields in the mud, trying to save their lives. The chaos was absolute, and the narrow terrain of Issus, which had earlier limited the strength of the Persians, now became a deadly trap for the mass escape. Thousands died, crushed in the attempt to flee, victims both of Macedonian spears and of the confusion generated by desperate flight. As Darius disappeared from the battlefield, he left behind not only his treasures, but something far more valuable, his own family. His mother, his wife, and his daughters were captured by Alexander's troops, in an episode that astonished even the Macedonians. The Persian king's wife, considered one of the most beautiful women in all of Asia, was taken prisoner along with the princesses, all terrified by their uncertain fate. This episode could have turned into a tragedy, but Alexander made a decision that revealed a different side of his character. He treated the royal family with the utmost respect, ensuring that none of them were touched or humiliated, and provided them with proper accommodations as if they still held their royal status. This unexpected gesture spread as a sign of his greatness and earned him respect even from enemies who had sworn his death. The capture of the royal family carried an immense symbolic weight. The king of Persia, the most powerful man in the Eastern world, had not only lost a battle, he had abandoned those he should have most protected. This abandonment in itself destroyed part of his credibility among his subjects and made it clear to all that Darius III was not prepared to face someone like Alexander. The news spread quickly, and the humiliation was as deep as the military defeat. At the same time, this event further strengthened Alexander's image as a fair and magnanimous leader, capable of showing mercy even in the midst of war. Beyond the people, an immense treasure fell into Macedonian hands. Gold, silver, weapons, war chariots, provisions, and luxury objects were abandoned in the Persian camp. This wealth further strengthened Alexander's campaign, guaranteeing resources to continue advancing without depending on supplies coming from Macedonia. But more than material wealth, the victory at Issus represented the conquest of something far greater: prestige. The Persians' absolute confidence in their invincibility had been shattered in a single day, and now everyone knew that a new power was rising in the world. While the royal family was led away under protection and the prisoners were counted, Alexander did not celebrate in an extravagant way. His mind was already turning to the next steps. Darius had escaped, and as long as he lived, the Persian Empire could still gather forces for another confrontation. But on that day, the balance of power had changed forever. Macedonia, a kingdom once seen as peripheral, had challenged and defeated the greatest power in the world. And all of this because one man dared to believe that battles are not won by numbers, but by strategy, courage, and discipline. When the dust began to settle, and the metallic sounds of battle gave way to a heavy silence, the fields around Issus were covered with the signs of the confrontation. Persian bodies lay in uncountable numbers, scattered in every direction, while the Macedonian army, though victorious, also bore deep marks of effort and sacrifice. Estimates recorded by ancient chroniclers describe an astonishing outcome: tens of thousands of Persians killed or captured, while Macedonian losses, though significant, were extremely small compared to the scale of the slaughter. The Persian numerical superiority was not only neutralized, but turned into a trap that crushed them in the confusion of their own flight. The battlefield became a symbol of the difference between an organized army and an army that relied only on sheer numbers. Persian losses were so immense that the narrow escape routes became clogged with dead soldiers, abandoned weapons, and fallen animals. Many died not in direct combat, but in the desperate attempt to flee through the narrow corridor between the sea and the mountains. The Persian elite units, which were supposed to protect Darius, also collapsed completely as soon as the king abandoned the field, and his hasty flight made it clear that the battle was over, even before the Macedonians had fully surrounded the area. On the Macedonian side, the casualties were smaller in number, but each fallen soldier represented a huge cost, for Alexander knew that he could not replace his men as easily as the Persian Empire could recruit new soldiers. Even so, the victory raised morale so high that the entire army seemed reinvigorated, as if every man had gained renewed strength to keep marching. The spoils obtained after the battle provided abundant resources: gold, silver, weapons, horses, provisions, and even more importantly, control over the region, ensuring that Alexander now had a solid base to advance deeper into Persian territory. Immediately after the victory, Alexander demonstrated his ability not only as a strategist, but as a political leader. He treated the wounded with dignity, both friend and foe, reinforcing the image that his war was against the rulers of Persia and not against the peoples who lived under their rule. This gesture of humanity earned him the trust of cities that had previously feared reprisals and that now began to open their gates to the young king without resistance. The victory at Issus was therefore more than a military conquest. It was a transformation in the political balance of the region. Alexander had proven that he could not only confront the greatest empire in the world, but defeat it in a humiliating fashion. The immediate result was the opening of the road south toward Egypt. Darius III, ashamed and humiliated, fled into the interior of the empire, leaving behind not only the royal family, but also his authority in the eyes of his subjects. Meanwhile, the Macedonians, strengthened by the victory, were ready to march even deeper into enemy territory. Issus had been only the beginning of a campaign that would change the history of the ancient world. The victory at Issus had immediate and profound political consequences, forever shifting the balance of power in the ancient world. Until that moment, the Persian Empire had been regarded as the dominant force, a structure so vast and wealthy that it seemed impossible to challenge. By personally defeating Darius III in direct confrontation and forcing him to flee, Alexander not only achieved a military victory, but destroyed the image of invincibility that the Persians had cultivated for centuries. This psychological collapse shook the foundations of the enemy empire and led many cities and territories under Persian control to reconsider their loyalty, weighing whether it would be safer to surrender to the young Macedonian king than to continue obeying a monarch who had shown fear at the most critical moment. Right after Issus, a domino effect began. The cities of Phoenicia, located along the Mediterranean coast, began to open their gates to Alexander, some voluntarily and others after small demonstrations of force. This advance gave him control of strategic ports and fortresses that would allow him to build a solid base for invading the Persian heartland later. At the same time, Egypt, which had been under Persian rule for years, saw in the Macedonian victory the perfect opportunity to free itself from Eastern control. When Alexander marched there, he was welcomed as a liberator, not as a conqueror. This consolidated a new alliance that would provide him not only with resources but also with religious prestige, as the Egyptian priests would recognize him as pharaoh. Politically, Issus also weakened Darius's standing among his own satraps and allies. His disorganized flight from the battlefield, abandoning even the royal family, was interpreted as a sign of weakness and cowardice. Local governors began to doubt their king's ability to protect them from the Macedonian offensive, and many began hiding resources or even negotiating secretly with Alexander to avoid reprisals in the future. The cohesion that sustained the massive Persian Empire, already fragile, began to disintegrate even faster after this defeat. Furthermore, the victory solidified Alexander's image not only as a victorious general, but as a monarch of almost mythical proportions. For the Greeks, he became the natural heir to a historic mission to avenge centuries of invasions and humiliations suffered during the Greco-Persian Wars. For other peoples, Alexander represented a new order, more dynamic, disciplined, and surprisingly just, since his conquests were accompanied by a policy of cultural respect that contrasted with the arrogance and rigid administration of Persia. This political prestige began to attract allies beyond the Greek world, expanding his influence far beyond what his father Philip had ever dreamed. Issus also marked the moment when Alexander ceased to be merely a bold young king and became a figure everyone understood was destined for something much greater. His name echoed throughout Asia, from the Aegean Sea to the plains of Mesopotamia, as a clear warning: Persian hegemony was nearing its end. This victory made the world realize that the war underway was not merely a campaign of vengeance, but a radical transformation of the geopolitical order. From that moment on, the two empires were set on a course for total collision, and Alexander's power only grew with every step. The military legacy of the Battle of Issus has crossed the centuries as a clear example of how intelligence, courage, and discipline can overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages. From the moment Alexander chose not to retreat in the face of an infinitely larger army, to the flawless execution of a plan that combined resistance at the center with a decisive strike from the flank, Issus became required study for every generation of strategists. The first lesson it leaves for history is that the choice of terrain can turn an unequal confrontation into a balanced battle. The narrow plain, bounded by the sea and the mountains, eliminated the Persian numerical factor and gave the Macedonian army the opportunity to fight as a unified and cohesive force. Another decisive aspect of Issus's legacy is the way Alexander used his cavalry. Instead of treating this unit merely as support, he transformed it into the central weapon of the decisive blow. The maneuver he personally led on the right wing, directing his cavalry in a wedge formation straight into the enemy's most valuable point, was an act of incomparable audacity. This strategy showed the world that a concentrated offensive, when carried out with speed and precision, can break an army much larger than the one launching it. The idea that a leader must be present at the crucial moment, inspiring and leading personally, also came to be seen as a psychological factor, as powerful as tactical skill itself. The discipline of the Macedonian army, trained to act as a single machine, revealed another great lesson of the battle: the importance of preparation and coordination. While the Persian lines, composed of soldiers from diverse cultures and languages, collapsed under confusion, the Macedonians maintained every formation intact, even under a rain of arrows and successive attacks. This difference in organization allowed a much smaller army to withstand the pressure until the moment for the final maneuver arrived. Issus became synonymous with the victory of quality over quantity. After the battle, the strategies used by Alexander were analyzed for centuries and cited by generals such as Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and many others who understood the value of surprise, intelligent selection of the battlefield, and rapid attacks against the enemy's most vulnerable point. Issus also left a fundamental political lesson. A victory is not only about eliminating enemy soldiers, but also about dismantling the opponent's confidence and morale. By forcing Darius to flee, Alexander destroyed the Persian spirit of resistance long before conquering the rest of the empire. To this day, military scholars see Issus as a turning point in military history, It represents the triumph of strategy over brute force and of inspiring leadership over distant bureaucratic command. Every detail, from the positioning of the troops to the speed of the attack, is still debated and taught as an example of flawless planning. On that narrow field, Alexander proved that genius can be more powerful than any multitude of soldiers. The Battle of Issus, beyond its military and political weight, left a profound mark on the culture and historical memory of the ancient world, becoming a recurring symbol in works of art, chronicles, and later traditions. From the chroniclers of the time, who described the scene in great detail, to the representations in Roman mosaics and murals centuries later, Issus came to be remembered as the clash in which two worlds collided, and in which courage and cunning triumphed over brute force. Among these representations, the famous Pompeii mosaic, found in the House of the Faun, remains one of the most emblematic images of all time. A dramatic composition in which Alexander, impetuous on his horse Bucephalus, advances toward Darius III, who looks terrified as his chariot pulls away from the battlefield. This mosaic became an icon because it captures the exact moment of the psychological turning point, the very essence of what Issus was. Greek and Roman historians such as Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus dedicated extensive pages to narrating the unfolding of this battle, emphasizing not only the military strategies, but also Alexander's personal stance. They describe how he led his men on the front lines, his determination to attack Darius directly, and the way his victory changed the course of history. These descriptions, repeated over the centuries, helped build the almost mythical image of the young king, turning the Battle of Issus into a legend that went beyond history and became part of the collective imagination of the Western world. In artistic tradition, Issus has always been treated as a grand visual spectacle, portraying the battle not just as a physical conflict, but as a clash of cultures and values. The iconography shows the contrast between Macedonian discipline and Persian opulence, the simplicity of Greek weapons against Eastern sophistication, and the calm yet bold figure of Alexander facing the terrified expression of Darius. Painters, sculptors, and writers have seen in this episode an example of individual courage capable of changing history. And throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the name of Alexander and the scene of Issus would reappear in chronicles and paintings, inspiring leaders, artists, and thinkers. From a literary point of view, Issus has been described as a moment when the fate of the ancient world lay in the hands of two men. Poets and philosophers have used the battle as a metaphor to speak of the fragility of power based solely on numbers and of the importance of character and strategic vision. The image of the young Macedonian king facing an entire empire became an epic narrative, repeated from generation to generation. As centuries passed, Issus ceased to be just an event of the past and became a symbol that, even in the face of overwhelming forces, intelligence, discipline, and courage can change everything. This cultural presence ensured that, long after the fall of Macedonia and Persia, Issus continued to live on in collective memory. Each description, each work of art, and each military study retells this story from new perspectives, but all agree on one point. Issus was not just a battle, it was a milestone of the human capacity to challenge the impossible and transform the destiny of the world. With the victory at Issus, Alexander ceased to be merely a bold young king and transformed into the most feared and respected conqueror of the entire ancient world. The path that opened before him after this battle was not only that of a military campaign, it was the beginning of the birth of an empire that would forever change history. The defeat of Darius III weakened Persian authority so deeply that the gates of vast regions began to open almost without resistance. Alexander immediately understood the importance of this opportunity and used his newly won prestige to advance without delay to the south, securing strategic ports, cities, and fortresses before the enemy had time to reorganize. After consolidating his position in Syria, Alexander moved on to Phoenicia. Some cities, terrified by the Persian defeat, surrendered peacefully, while others, like Tyre, offered fierce resistance, requiring a prolonged siege. The victory at Issus had shown the world that Macedonia was not a temporary invasion, and this perception made every step Alexander took seem inevitable. Next, the conqueror turned his attention to Egypt, a territory that had been under Persian rule for centuries, and that saw in his arrival the chance to break free. His entry into Egyptian lands was welcomed as that of a liberator. The Egyptian priests recognized him as pharaoh, granting him political and religious legitimacy, and it was there that he founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest cultural centers in the world. As he advanced, Darius III desperately tried to reorganize his forces. He sent messages offering peace and even lands in exchange for a truce, but Alexander refused. For him, it was not enough to win battles. It was necessary to bring down the Persian Empire completely. This decision marked the fundamental difference between his ambition and the limited vision of other leaders of the time. He did not seek merely secure borders or temporary wealth. He wanted to unify the known world under his command. Issus had been only the first great demonstration of this purpose, and every step from then on would be taken with the same audacity. The triumph at Issus also consolidated in the Macedonian army an absolute trust in its commander. The soldiers saw in Alexander a leader who never abandoned them and who was willing to take the same risks as they did. This bond created unbreakable loyalty, turning a relatively small group of men into an unstoppable war machine. The prestige of this victory spread throughout the conquered lands, and entire peoples began to pledge allegiance, believing that resistance was useless. The campaign took on an almost mystical dimension. Alexander was no longer just a general, but a man who seemed guided by destiny. From Issus onward, history was no longer divided between Persia and Greece. Something new was born, the Hellenistic world, a world where Greek culture would merge with Eastern traditions, creating a legacy that would endure for centuries. And it all began in that narrow corridor between the sea and the mountains, where a small and disciplined army challenged a gigantic empire and won. Issus was not the end of a battle, but the beginning of an era. The Battle of Issus remains in history as one of those rare moments when two worlds collide, and from that clash something completely new is born. On that narrow strip of land between the sea and the mountains, on a day in the year 333 before Christ, the age-old tradition and confidence of the Persian Empire came face to face with the audacity, speed, and military genius of a young Macedonian who dared to challenge everything that seemed impossible. Issus was not just a fight between two armies. It was a battle for the future, the definition of which culture would shape the coming generations and how the balance of power in the ancient world would be reorganized. Alexander's victory transformed the course of history in just a few hours, proving that courage and strategy could bring down walls that once seemed insurmountable. This battle marked the symbolic fall of Persian invincibility. By forcing Darius III to flee and capturing his family, Alexander shattered the prestige of the greatest empire on earth and demonstrated that a small kingdom, united by discipline and intelligence, could prevail against colossal forces. At the same time, Issus inaugurated a new form of leadership in which the commander did not hide behind his troops, but placed himself on the front line, inspiring his men by example. The image of the young king carrying his spear, leading the cavalry in a direct charge against the enemy's center, became a symbol that war is not decided solely by numbers, but by ideas and decisive action. The consequences of Issus transcended the military field. From that moment, Alexander opened the gates to Hellenistic expansion, carrying the Greek language, culture, and ideas to lands that had never even heard of Macedonia. This encounter between West and East, violent and transformative, created a legacy that shaped cities, arts, sciences, and systems of government for centuries. By uniting such different worlds, Alexander ceased to be just a conquering king and became a turning point in the history of civilization. Issus reminds us even today that history is made up of moments in which quick and daring decisions change the destiny of entire peoples. That day, when the fate of one empire was undone and another began to rise, remains one of the clearest proofs that greatness is not measured by the number of men, but by the clarity of vision and the ability to act at the right moment. From the dust of that battlefield, Alexander the Great began to build not just an empire, but an era. Issus was, in essence, the moment when two worlds met, clashed, and from that collision, a new world was born.